All right, everybody, we are back with our second subsection on, and this time we're going to focus on cyber warfare, right? And so this is the use of cyber tools for, in addition to, or in support of, or sometimes instead of more traditional military, tanks and bombs and guns and et cetera, et cetera. Now, cyber warfare can be very small and very targeted, or it can be very large scale, right? So, in a targeted way, think more of infecting an enemy's communication satellites so that you can overhear their communications and be prepared and spy on their preparations and activities and practices and so on and so forth. Or it can be large scale. You can have a whole bunch of a spread of lots of different things all going on, a huge giant attack taking down entire systems, again usually in support of or in addition to some kind of physical invasion kind of thing. When it comes to cyber warfare, like in regular warfare, there's both the actual attack in the cyber world. This could be taking down a electrical system or erasing the avionics of fighter jets and bomber planes in flight. But there's also spying, right? There's gathering intelligence about the enemy's movements, about the enemy's capabilities, about the enemy's organization that would allow you to more effectively fight an actual war, right? So an attack, I might, disable an enemy's email system or communication system so they can't talk to each other. Spying, I might hack, that same communication system, I might just listen and let them keep communicating, right? So spying and attacking are two very different aspects, but they are both part of this whole cyber warfare kind of umbrella. Now, when it comes to traditional warfare, it's usually pretty easy to say, if country A invades country B is going to know that it was country A that invaded, right? Because usually their soldiers are wearing uniforms, their tanks have flags on them, etc., etc. But with cyber warfare, it can be a lot more difficult to even know you're under attack in the first place. But even if you do know you're under attack, to figure out where it's coming from, who's doing it, right? So if the United States military all of a sudden figures out, we're, a cyber attack is coming, all our military communications are down and our tanks are doing this bad thing and our, all these other issues we're having, they might not know whether it's China or Canada or Germany or, who. We know somebody's attacking us, but we don't know who. And that's relatively unique to the field of cyber war rather than more traditional war. So what kind of processes can happen in a cyber war? Well, it can start and is much more commonly associated with things like disinformation campaigns, right? Even in traditional warfare, governments need to spread kind of propaganda. They need to make people see them as the good guys in the war, and the people they're fighting they need to see as the bad guys, right? This is something, as I'm recording this, Russia is engaged in a war with the Ukraine, and Russia is trying very hard to promote disinformation about the reason for their invasion and why Ukraine is bad and how the Ukrainians in the Russian-occupied territories are so happy that the Russians are there. None of which, of course, is true, but it is having a lot of effect, especially within Russia, but also kind of around the world. There are a lot of people around the world that see Russia as the good guys in that invasion, thanks to Russia's disinformation campaigns. Another common tool with cyber warfare is logic bombs. And these are not unique to cyber warfare. These can be done by terrorist groups or just criminals for tons of different reasons. But the short version, the short explanation for logic bombs is that they're kind of break glass in case of emergency malware, right? So it's essentially a protection against future lack of access. So if we, the American military hacks into a Chinese communication satellite, and we might not be able to come back here and if the Chinese government fixes the vulnerability that allows us to hack into that satellite, we're not going to be able to come back. So we're going to leave just a few lines of code, right? Any given software system could have thousands or millions of lines of code, and we can insert in a random spot just one or two lines that'll probably never be noticed, right? And those two lines of code could say something like, if you hear this certain signal, start erasing all of your software, right? And now, even if we get kind of knocked out of that system, that code will remain. And we know that if it ever comes to a shooting war between China and the United States only has to send a certain signal to that satellite. It'll hit those lines of code that were left behind as that logic bomb. And then that code will execute and that software will start getting erased, right? And logic bombs can kind of take essentially an infinite number of different forms. But it's sit there and wait until either something happens, or sometimes wait until a thing stops happening and then run this piece of code. Do this thing. So it's like a really fancy piece of malware that is sitting there waiting like a time bomb. Okay. Now, one of the difficulties with cyber warfare is that militaries are not only responsible for offense against enemies, but they're also responsible for defense, right? So here in the United States, we want to have the offensive capability against possible enemies, but our military is also responsible for defending ourselves. And with an increasingly digital world, we might be using the same software or hardware that our enemies are using, or our potential enemies are using, right? And if we find a flaw, a hole, a problem in that software or hardware, we have to make a choice. We can either leave that flaw there, thinking we might be able to exploit it against our enemies, or we can tell the company that makes that software or hardware about the problem so they can fix it, which protects us because we use that same software and hardware, but it also prevents us from exploiting it against our potential enemies. So it's kind of a balancing act. Do we want to kind of fix these problems and thus protect ourselves, but take away a possible opportunity for having an advantage over our enemies? Or do we want to have that advantage over our enemies and be able to get into those systems and exploit those vulnerabilities, knowing that we also might have that problem? Somebody else might be using that same vulnerability to get into our systems. So because so many pieces of software and hardware and so on are so kind of universal at this point, it can be a difficult balancing act between exploiting some vulnerability or having it fixed and protecting both ourselves and our possible enemies. So one of the balancing acts, one of the kind of issues with any country's military and their cyber capabilities is offensive capability balanced with defensive susceptibility, right? So here in the United States, we have one of the most well-trained offensive, military computer divisions or organizations on the planet. We are really good. We got a lot of really good computer people working for our military. On the other hand, we are much more susceptible defensively. We are more integrated into a digital infrastructure in the United States. We have more of our day-to-day lives, more of our financial system, more of our the general public's livelihood and day-to-day everything is controlled by some kind of computerized systems, right? Contrast that with, say, North Korea. And their offensive capability isn't nearly as good as the United States is. They have a pretty good hacking group working for their military. Not as good as ours, but good. But on the other hand, they have almost zero defensive susceptibility. We could take out their entire internet-based, computerized, digital infrastructure for the country, and life really wouldn't change that much for anybody, right? Their society is just not as reliant on computers and computer-controlled infrastructure as ours is. So they have decent to good offensive capability, but almost zero defensive susceptibility. And every country in the world is going to have that kind of varying levels of kind of offense, but also they have to protect themselves, because if they become the victims, some countries are going to face very little disruption or damage from a cyber attack because they're just not that integrated into digital technology, whereas other countries are going to be really highly at threat. So here in the United States, we're kind of extreme on both ends. Most of the modern industrialized Western world is kind of up there, extreme on both ends. Poorer countries are going to be lower on at least the defensive susceptibility usually. But so that's a balancing act that warfighters need to be kind of aware of. Another aspect of modern warfare that needs to be discussed when it comes to cyber technology is the weird little stuff. Even in a traditional warfare scenario with troops and tanks and planes and bombs, cyber aspects are going to kind of factor into it, right? So here we have the story of a European soldier who was conducting war games with another country. And they use something as easy as an online dating service and a cell phone to figure out exactly where the enemy is. This other country, I'm sure they had all kinds of ways to prevent being found by their enemies, but a dating app gave away their position, right? It's these little things that a lot of militaries either haven't thought of or didn't take sufficient steps to prevent that are going to impact warfare and casualties and all kinds of different factors in a traditional military scenario. In ways that we just can't really predict yet, right? Now, some famous examples of cyber warfare to some degree or another. Obviously, for many years, most of the 20th century, there was a country called the USSR, the Soviet Union, and they were kind of made up of Russia and many of the Eastern European and Asian countries that all kind of joined together as one into the Soviet Union. And then in the early 90s, the Soviet Union collapsed. And now all those countries are independent again. One of those countries that was part of the Soviet Union but is now independent was Estonia. And while they were part of the Soviet Union, the Russians set up some monuments, including one devoted to the World War II Soviet soldiers because millions of them died fighting in World War II. And so there was a monument in Estonia to these Soviet soldiers. And in 2007, the Estonian government decided, hey, we're not part of the Soviet Union anymore. We're going to take down this monument to Soviet soldiers because, you know, that's another country now. And many hackers within the country of Russia got very upset at this. And this is an example of one of those times where it's hard to determine whether these were individual Russians or these were kind of under the direction of the Russian government. But offenders in Russia, whether they were part of the government or not is up in the air, but they decided to attack the Estonian government and banking systems, and they took down a large part of the Estonian banking system and many of their government websites for days or I think even weeks, maybe months at a time, because they were upset at this monument coming down. Another great example of cyber warfare is the Stuxnet virus, which I briefly discussed in a previous section. But remember, Stuxnet was a virus created, you know, it's never been officially confirmed, but the supposition is kind of by the United States and Israel, that was very specifically targeted at uranium enrichment facilities within the country of Iran. It was kind of a brilliant piece of malware, because first of all, this uranium enrichment facility was not connected to the wider internet. So this virus had to kind of find a way to sneak in. So essentially what the creators did was they put the Stuxnet virus on some flash drives and set it to infect any other flash drives those flash drives came in contact with. And then sent flash drives with some information, some other kind of bogus information, to many different companies working in the Iranian nuclear facilities. Those flash drives infected many other flash drives at this facility, and eventually one of the people who worked for those companies brought an infected flash drive into this Iranian nuclear facility and plugged it into their isolated computer system, which infected that computer system, that computer network with this Stuxnet virus. And then the Stuxnet virus kind of found all of these centrifuges, right? So machines that spin very, very quickly in order to enrich uranium. And then it kind of sat there and listened and waited for, I think, weeks or months, and kind of learned what those centrifuges were supposed to be doing. And then it started changing what the centrifuges were actually doing in a way that damaged the machines while still displaying to the users and the technicians responsible kind of the normal activity that those centrifuges were supposed to be showing. So all the data that the engineers and technicians were looking at said everything was fine, when in reality those centrifuges were like destroying themselves, tearing themselves apart, you know, over stressing themselves to the point of failure. So Stuxnet was kind of a very specifically designed piece of malware to attack that Iranian government facility. And then, of course, there's the 2016 presidential election. The Russian government and people acting on behalf of the Russian government were constantly posting misinformation, getting into the email account of the Democratic nominee's campaign manager, spreading all kinds of propaganda, doing different hacks, attempting to manipulate the country into voting for one party over the other. And that is, by some definitions, an act of cyber warfare. By other definitions, it might just be criminal or cyber terrorism, but it definitely had a huge impact on our country. I mean, it's almost certain that the 2016 presidential election was, you know, the person who actually won would not have won without that concerted effort by the Russian people or the Russian government to try to attack the United States and get that person elected. Now, here in the United States, who is responsible for cyber warfare? Well, there's the NSA, the National Security Agency. They're responsible for protecting the people of the United States against cyber terrorism and to some degree also cyber warfare. They had a program, a very controversial program called PRISM, which started, I think, 2007, that was gathering huge amounts of online information without a warrant. And it was supposed to be targeted at foreign nationals, so no warrant was needed. But it also gathered, apparently, a lot of information on American citizens without a warrant in order to do data mining to try to find terrorist groups, terrorist cells. U.S. Cyber Command is a division of the United States military, and their job is both offensive and defensive. They want to use cyber techniques to help their warfighting capability and also defend the U.S. military and the U.S. government against cyber attack. And then the Department of Energy, they have a huge role in this, not just because so many of the attractive targets, both for cyber warfare and cyber terrorism, are energy related, i.e. the power grid, power plants, oil pipelines. Those are all energy related. But also because the Department of Energy is the primary government group responsible for the United States stockpile of nuclear weapons, right? So it would be the military that actually utilizes them, but it's the Department of Energy that is responsible for handling them and storing them and keeping them safe. And then, of course, there's the FBI and Homeland Security. They're charged with protecting and investigating cyber attacks, not just from criminals, but also terrorists. Their objective is to protect the American people, individual businesses and people and organizations that are non-military, non-government. They help protect and educate and train and then investigate when something bad does happen and try to hold those people to account. Anyway, that is the end of our section. Again, cyber warfare and cyber terror is such a huge, giant field. I could teach an entire class just about this subject. It's a very complicated subject. It's a very difficult subject. You get into all kinds of political arguments with people about who the good guys are and who the bad guys are, and whether something's actually disinformation or whether it's real information, whether something's, fake news or real news, all these things. But it's an absolutely fascinating subject. If you're interested, especially in Stuxnet, that virus I was telling you about earlier, I barely brushed the surface of how that thing worked and why it was so impactful and important. There's a book called Countdown to Zero Day that I highly recommend. But anyway, again, if you're still watching, I really appreciate it. Thank you so much, and I will see you in the next one.